The strange thing about betrayal is that sometimes the room knows before you do. I did not understand what that meant until the night my marriage changed forever. My name is Michael Reynolds. I am 43 years old, and until that evening, I believed I knew my wife better than anyone else in the world. Rachel and I had been married for 14 years. We were not perfect. No couple is. We had disagreements about work, finances, and how much time I spent traveling for business. But we always found our way back to each other. At least, that was what I thought. The party was supposed to be a celebration. One of Rachel's closest friends had recently been promoted, and a large gathering was being held at an upscale hotel downtown. There were nearly 100 people there. Business owners, friends, family members, people Rachel had known for years. She seemed unusually excited about the event. Looking back now, that should have been my first clue. During the week leading up to the party, she spent far more time on her appearance than usual. She checked her phone constantly. She smiled at messages she never explained. When I asked what was making her so happy, she simply said she was feeling optimistic about the future. At the time, I thought nothing of it. We arrived shortly after 7 in the evening. The ballroom was beautiful. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished floors. Music played softly in the background. Waiters moved through the crowd carrying trays of appetizers and drinks. Everything looked elegant. Yet almost immediately, I sensed something was different. Rachel was physically beside me, but emotionally somewhere else. Her attention seemed fixed on people across the room. Every few minutes she glanced toward the entrance, as if waiting for someone. When I spoke, she answered politely but briefly. It felt like talking to a stranger wearing my wife's face. An hour passed, then another. The uncomfortable feeling in my stomach continued to grow. Several times I noticed Rachel speaking privately with a man I did not recognize. He was confident, well-dressed, and clearly familiar with many people at the event. Whenever I looked in their direction, the conversation ended quickly. Again, I told myself I was overthinking things. Jealousy had never been part of our marriage. I trusted her. That trust was about to be tested. Around 9 o'clock, the host tapped a microphone and thanked everyone for attending. Conversations gradually quieted. People turned toward the small stage near the center of the ballroom. I expected a short speech about career achievements and future goals. Instead, Rachel surprised me by walking toward the microphone herself. At first, I smiled. She had always been comfortable speaking in front of groups. Several guests applauded as she stepped onto the stage. Then she looked directly at me. The smile disappeared from her face. Something cold settled into my chest. The room suddenly felt smaller. Rachel took a deep breath. Around us, people waited expectantly. Some held drinks. Others leaned forward with curiosity. Nobody knew what was coming. Neither did I. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the crowded ballroom. 14 years of memories flashed through my mind. Holidays, road trips, late-night conversations, the life we had built together. Then Rachel adjusted the microphone and opened her mouth to speak. And in that instant, before a single word left her lips, I realized that whatever happened next was going to change everything. The first words out of Rachel's mouth were not what anyone expected. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she said, her voice steady and confident. Several guests smiled politely. Others lifted their glasses. The atmosphere still felt celebratory. For a brief moment, I convinced myself I had imagined the tension. Then she continued, "Tonight is about new beginnings." The phrase sounded harmless enough. Yet something about the way she said it made my stomach tighten. I noticed a few people exchanging curious looks. Rachel glanced toward the man she had been speaking with throughout the evening. He gave her a small nod. That was when I knew. I did not understand exactly what was happening, but I knew it involved me. Rachel took another breath and looked directly at me. "Some chapters in life eventually come to an end," she said. The room became noticeably quieter. And sometimes the most honest thing we can do is admit when we have outgrown the life we once thought we wanted. My heart felt strangely calm. Perhaps it was shock. Perhaps it was instinct. Either way, I remained completely still. Around me, people began sensing that this was no ordinary speech. Rachel continued speaking. Every sentence felt carefully rehearsed. Every word sounded prepared long before we arrived at the party. Then she finally said the thing nobody in the room could ignore. "Michael and I have decided to go our separate ways." A collective silence swept across the ballroom. It was not loud. Silence never is. But it was powerful. Hundreds of conversations died at the same time. Every eye turned toward me. I heard someone quietly gasp near the back of the room. Another person whispered something to their spouse. Rachel remained on stage holding the microphone. The expression on her face suggested relief, as though she had been carrying this announcement for weeks and was finally free to release it. The strange part was her choice of words. "We have decided." The statement was not true. This was the first time I had heard any of it. Yet I did not interrupt. I did not stand up. I did not create a scene. Years in business had taught me something valuable. When emotions take control, people stop seeing clearly. So I stayed seated and listened. Rachel continued speaking about personal growth, new opportunities, and following the right path. The words sounded polished, inspirational even. But beneath them, the message was simple. Our marriage was over. Then came the moment that made everything unmistakably clear. Rachel looked toward the same man once again. This time she smiled openly. Several people in the audience followed her gaze. Recognition spread across their faces. Suddenly pieces of the evening began falling into place. The private conversations, the constant glances, the unusual excitement, the emotional distance. None of it had been accidental. The man stepped forward slightly from the crowd. He looked confident, comfortable, as though he already knew what was coming next. Rachel introduced him as Brandon Cole, a successful entrepreneur, a respected investor, someone many people in the room already knew. The atmosphere shifted again. Now guests were not simply surprised. They were connecting dots. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed fascinated. Nobody knew where to look. Rachel, Brandon, or me. Through it all, I remained seated. I could feel dozens of eyes studying my reaction. People expected anger. They expected confrontation. Maybe even desperation. Instead, I simply stood up from my chair. The movement drew even more attention. Rachel's confident expression flickered for the first time. Just slightly, almost imperceptibly. I adjusted my suit jacket and looked toward the stage. 14 years of marriage had just been reduced to a public announcement. Yet the strongest emotion I felt was not rage. It was disappointment. Because somewhere deep inside, I realized Rachel had already made one critical mistake. She believed she understood the entire story, and she had no idea how much she was missing. For several seconds, nobody moved. It was as if the entire ballroom had forgotten how conversations worked. Rachel remained on the stage holding the microphone. Brandon stood nearby with the confident smile of a man who believed he had already won. Around them, dozens of guests watched me carefully. Some looked sympathetic. Others seemed fascinated by the unfolding drama. A few appeared uncomfortable, as though they suddenly wished they were somewhere else. I could hardly blame them. Public humiliation has a way of making everyone in the room feel awkward. As I stood beside my table, Rachel spoke again. "Michael and I have grown into different people," she said. "Sometimes holding on prevents both people from becoming who they are meant to be." Several guests nodded politely. The words sounded thoughtful, mature even, but they felt strangely disconnected from reality. 14 years of marriage was being summarized in carefully prepared phrases designed to sound inspirational. What surprised me most was not the announcement itself. It was how much planning had clearly gone into it. Rachel had chosen the venue, the audience, the timing. Every detail had been arranged long before I walked through those ballroom doors. Brandon stepped forward and placed a reassuring hand on Rachel's shoulder. The gesture lasted only a moment, but it spoke volumes. More whispers spread through the crowd. The picture was becoming clear, at least the version Rachel wanted everyone to see. I glanced around the room. Then I noticed something interesting. Not everyone looked impressed. In fact, several people appeared confused. One older couple sitting near the stage exchanged concerned expressions. A business associate I recognized from previous events slowly shook his head. Others avoided eye contact entirely. The reaction Rachel expected was not happening. People were not celebrating. They were observing, judging, processing. Human beings understand that there is a difference between ending a relationship and turning it into a public performance. Rachel seemed unaware of the distinction. Finally, she looked directly at me. "Do you have anything you would like to say?" The question hung in the air. Every face turned toward me once again. This was the moment many people had been waiting for. The confrontation, the argument, the emotional reaction. I could almost feel their expectations. Instead, I smiled faintly. Not because I was happy, because I suddenly understood something important. Rachel believed she controlled the narrative. She believed the evening was unfolding exactly as she had planned. She believed everyone was seeing me as the defeated husband left behind while she moved toward a brighter future. The problem was that reality rarely cooperates with carefully written scripts. "No," I said calmly. The single word seemed to surprise everyone, including Rachel. "No," she repeated. "No," I said again. "I do not have anything to add tonight." A look of confusion crossed her face. Brandon's confident expression faded slightly. They expected resistance. They expected questions. They expected me to fight for the microphone. Instead, I simply picked up my jacket from the back of my chair. The ballroom remained silent. "I wish you both the best," I said. Then I turned and began walking toward the exit. The crowd parted naturally as I moved through it. Several people stepped aside. A few offered sympathetic looks. One man quietly nodded in my direction. I appreciated the gesture more than he probably realized. Behind me, I heard Rachel call my name. Once. Then again. I kept walking. Not because I was angry. Because there was nothing left to discuss in that room. Whatever conversation needed to happen would happen elsewhere. As I reached the lobby, my phone vibrated. Normally, I would have ignored it. But the email came from a company called Horizon Ventures. Most people at the party would not have recognized the name. Rachel certainly would not have. That was because I had spent the last 3 years keeping the project separate from my personal life. Not out of secrecy, out of caution. Business deals have a way of attracting attention long before they are finished. I preferred results over promises. Standing alone in the hotel lobby, I opened the message and read every word carefully. Then I read it a second time. The final approval had arrived. After years of negotiations, development, regulatory reviews, and investor meetings, the acquisition was officially complete. The company I had quietly helped build was being purchased as part of a major expansion deal. The numbers attached to the agreement were substantial, far larger than anything Rachel had ever imagined. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and took a slow breath. Under normal circumstances, I would have celebrated. Instead, I felt strangely detached. My marriage had just ended in front of a ballroom full of people. Financial success suddenly felt less important. As I walked toward the parking garage, my phone vibrated again. This time it was a call from my business partner, Daniel Harper. "Michael, congratulations," he said immediately. His excitement was impossible to miss. "It is official." I saw the email. "Do you realize what this means?" I laughed softly. "Tonight has been unusual. I am still processing everything." Daniel paused. "Is something wrong?" For a moment, I considered telling him the entire story. Instead, I simply said, "Rachel decided to end our marriage tonight." Silence filled the line. "At the party?" he asked. Apparently, news traveled quickly. "At the party." Another pause followed. Then Daniel sighed. "Well, this timing is going to surprise a lot of people." I understood exactly what he meant. For years, nearly everyone outside my closest business circle had assumed I was simply a successful consultant. I never corrected them. I never felt the need. The larger project remained confidential until the acquisition closed. Even Rachel only knew pieces of it. She understood I worked long hours. She knew I attended meetings and traveled occasionally. What she never understood was the scale of what had been developing behind the scenes. That was partly my fault. I rarely talked about business at home. Not because I was hiding anything. Because I believed family deserved a break from boardrooms and contracts. As I pulled out of the parking garage, my phone continued buzzing with notifications. Emails, messages, calls from investors and colleagues. The news was spreading rapidly through professional circles. Horizon Ventures was a major player in the industry. Their acquisition announcement would attract attention. A lot of attention. 20 minutes later, I arrived home. The house felt unusually quiet. Rachel had not returned yet. I loosened my tie and sat alone in the kitchen. For the first time all evening, I allowed myself to think clearly. The sequence of events felt surreal. A public breakup, Brandon's appearance, the carefully prepared speech. Then this unexpected business milestone arriving at precisely the same moment. I stared out the window into the darkness. Eventually, another notification appeared. This time it came from social media. Someone from the party had posted photographs from the event. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened the post. The images showed smiling guests, elegant decorations, and Rachel standing confidently on stage. Hundreds of comments were already appearing beneath the pictures. Then I noticed something else. New comments were beginning to appear from people outside the party. People reacting not to Rachel's announcement, but to breaking business news connected to Horizon Ventures. Within minutes, the conversation underneath the photographs started changing direction entirely. And for the first time that evening, I began to suspect that Rachel and Brandon were about to learn something neither of them had anticipated. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Not Rachel's announcement, not Brandon's appearance, not the dramatic moment that had unfolded in front of nearly 100 guests. Those details still existed, but they were being pushed aside by something much larger. Horizon Ventures had officially released its acquisition statement before the markets opened. Industry websites picked it up first, then business publications, then local news outlets. By 8 o'clock, my phone had accumulated more notifications than I could realistically read. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and watched the situation develop from a distance. The most surreal part was seeing my own name appear in articles written by people I had never met. For years, I had worked quietly behind the scenes. Now reporters were describing the project as one of the most successful private development ventures in the region. The financial details were not entirely public, but enough information had been released to attract attention. A lot of attention. Around 9 o'clock, Daniel called again. "Have you seen the coverage?" he asked. "Some of it." He laughed. "You are trending in 3 different business publications." I shook my head. The entire concept felt ridiculous. While the business world celebrated a major acquisition, I was still trying to process the collapse of my marriage. Success and disappointment were sharing the same space in my life. Before ending the call, Daniel mentioned something interesting. "People are connecting the dots." "What dots?" I asked. "The party photographs." My stomach tightened slightly. "What about them?" "Apparently several guests posted pictures online. Some reporters recognized you." Once the acquisition news broke, people started asking questions. After the call ended, curiosity got the better of me. I opened social media again. Daniel was right. The comments had changed dramatically since the previous night. Many people now recognized me from interviews, industry conferences, and public filings connected to the acquisition. Under one photograph showing Rachel on stage, dozens of comments had appeared. Most were not hostile. They were simply confused. People wanted to know why someone would publicly end a marriage with a man who had just become the central figure in a major business success story. The irony made me uncomfortable. The comments missed the point entirely. This was never supposed to be about money. Yet perception has a way of creating its own narrative. Around lunchtime, my phone rang. Rachel's name appeared on the screen. For several seconds, I stared at it without answering. Eventually, the call stopped. A minute later, another call arrived. Then another. By the 4th attempt, a voicemail notification appeared. I listened to the message. Rachel sounded different. Gone was the confidence from the stage. Gone was the certainty. Her voice carried something I had not heard in weeks. Uncertainty. "Michael, we need to talk," she said. "Please call me when you can." I set the phone down and stared out the window. Less than 24 hours earlier, Rachel had stood before a crowd and announced that our marriage was over. Now she suddenly wanted a conversation. The timing felt impossible to ignore. Yet even then, I resisted jumping to conclusions. People are complicated. Motivations are rarely as simple as they appear. Still, another detail caught my attention. 20 minutes later, Brandon's name began appearing in discussions connected to the acquisition coverage. Not because of success, because journalists were examining his business history. And what they were finding was raising questions. Serious questions. As the afternoon progressed, I realized something important. Rachel believed she understood By late afternoon, the mood surrounding the story had shifted completely. What began as gossip about a public breakup was evolving into something far more complicated. News articles continued discussing the Horizon Ventures acquisition, but another topic was beginning to attract attention. Brandon Cole. I first noticed it when Daniel forwarded me a link accompanied by a short message. "Read this." The article itself was not dramatic. In fact, it was surprisingly professional. A business journalist had reviewed several of Brandon's recent ventures and raised questions about their long-term performance. There were no accusations, no scandals, no sensational claims, just facts. Several projects had underperformed. A few partnerships had quietly dissolved. Investors had expressed concerns about consistency. None of this made Brandon a bad person, but it painted a very different picture from the one he projected at the party. The image of effortless success was beginning to crack. Around 5 o'clock, my phone rang again. Rachel. This time I answered. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, she broke the silence. Thank you for picking up. Her voice sounded tired. Not emotional, just tired. What did you want to talk about? I asked. Another pause followed. Can we meet? The request itself was not surprising. The timing was. Less than 24 hours earlier, she had stood before a ballroom full of people announcing the end of our marriage. Now she wanted a private conversation. Why? I asked calmly. Rachel hesitated. Because things are not exactly what I thought they were. The statement caught my attention. Not because it explained anything. Because it suggested she was beginning to question her own assumptions. What changed? I asked. She did not answer immediately. Can we just meet? Eventually, I agreed to speak with her the following day at a quiet coffee shop near the lake. After ending the call, I sat in silence for several minutes. Something about the conversation felt different. Rachel sounded uncertain. Not manipulative. Not defensive. Uncertain. That distinction mattered. Later that evening, another unexpected development occurred. Daniel called once more. This time his tone was more serious than excited. I received a call from someone connected to Brandon's network, he said. Apparently there is a lot of panic happening. I frowned. Panic. People are realizing the public perception gap. He explained that several individuals had assumed Brandon possessed far greater financial stability and influence than reality supported. The contrast became especially obvious once Horizon Ventures released detailed information regarding the acquisition. Suddenly comparisons were unavoidable. Again, I found the situation uncomfortable. I never wanted the story to become a competition between two men. Yet that seemed to be exactly what was happening. More importantly, I began understanding something Rachel might have overlooked. She believed she was leaving one future and stepping into a better one. But her decision was based on assumptions rather than facts. Assumptions about success. Assumptions about stability. Assumptions about people. The next morning arrived with heavy gray clouds covering the city. As I drove toward the coffee shop, I found myself surprisingly calm. A few days earlier, I would have expected anger, resentment, frustration. Instead, I mostly felt curious. Rachel had made her choice. Then something happened quickly enough to shake her confidence. The question was why. I arrived first and chose a table near the window. Rain began falling softly outside. 10 minutes later, Rachel walked through the door. The moment I saw her, I knew something significant had changed. The confidence from the ballroom was gone. The certainty was gone. Even the carefully controlled smile she wore in public had disappeared. She sat across from me and lowered her eyes for a moment. Then she looked up. Michael, she said quietly, I think I made a terrible mistake. For several seconds, I simply looked at her. Rain tapped softly against the coffee shop windows while people moved quietly around us, completely unaware that a marriage was sitting at a crossroads in the corner of the room. Rachel's words lingered between us. I think I made a terrible mistake. 24 hours earlier, she had stood confidently on a stage in front of nearly 100 people. Now she looked like someone trying to understand how everything had unraveled so quickly. I remained calm. What mistake are you talking about? I asked. Rachel lowered her eyes toward her coffee cup. I thought I understood what I wanted. The answer felt incomplete. She knew it too. And now? I asked. She exhaled slowly. Now I am not sure I understood anything at all. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Rachel began telling me things she probably should have said months earlier. She admitted that over the last 2 years, she had become increasingly focused on appearances. Not luxury. Not money specifically. Appearances. She spent more time comparing our lives to the lives of people she saw online, at events, and in professional circles. Every success story seemed bigger. Every relationship seemed more exciting. Every opportunity seemed more glamorous. I started convincing myself that we were standing still, she said quietly, even though we were not. I listened without interrupting. Rachel continued. Brandon had entered her life during a series of networking events. He presented himself as someone constantly moving forward, someone with ambitious plans and endless possibilities. Everything sounded exciting. Predictable routines suddenly felt boring by comparison. Stable relationships felt ordinary. Looking back, she admitted she had confused excitement with substance. I thought I was choosing a bigger future, she said, but I was really choosing an illusion. Her honesty surprised me. Not because I doubted she could be honest. Because people rarely admit uncomfortable truths about themselves so quickly. Then she told me what happened after the party. Once the acquisition news became public, conversations started changing. Friends called. Colleagues reached out. People who knew both of us began asking questions. At first, Rachel assumed they were reacting to the business success. Instead, many of them focused on something else entirely. The way she handled the breakup. Several people privately told her the same thing. They were not shocked that a marriage ended. Marriages end every day. They were shocked by how publicly she chose to do it. The realization hit harder than she expected. Then came Brandon. According to Rachel, the confident certainty he displayed at the party disappeared almost immediately. Questions about his business history made him defensive. Discussions about future plans became vague. The impressive image she had spent months admiring suddenly felt less convincing. Everything started changing in a matter of hours, she admitted. It was like watching a curtain fall. I looked out the window for a moment. The rain had become heavier. Cars moved slowly along the wet street. Finally, I asked the question that mattered most. Is this about the acquisition? Rachel looked genuinely hurt. No. The answer came immediately, too quickly to be rehearsed. At least not in the way you think. She paused. The acquisition forced me to see something, but it is not the reason I am here. I said nothing. Rachel's eyes filled with regret. Not dramatic regret. Quiet regret. The kind that arrives after pride finally leaves the room. I spent so much time looking at what I thought was missing that I stopped appreciating what was already there. Her voice trembled slightly, and by the time I realized it, I had already walked onto that stage. For the first time since this entire situation began, I believed she was telling the truth. The problem was that truth and forgiveness are not the same thing. And as I sat there listening, I realized Rachel was finally beginning to understand the difference. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Outside, the rain eventually stopped. Inside, neither of us seemed eager to leave. Rachel continued speaking with a level of honesty I had not seen in a long time. There were no dramatic excuses, no attempts to shift blame, no elaborate explanations designed to make her choices sound reasonable, just uncomfortable truth. And sometimes uncomfortable truth carries more weight than any apology. At one point, she looked directly at me and asked a question I never expected to hear. When did you stop fighting for us? I almost smiled. Not because the question was funny, because it revealed how differently we remembered the same marriage. I never stopped, I said quietly. Rachel looked confused, so I told her things I had never said out loud. I reminded her about the weekends I canceled business travel because she wanted more time together. The opportunities one declined because they required relocating. The countless small decisions nobody notices because they happen in ordinary moments rather than dramatic ones. For years, I believed love was demonstrated through consistency, through showing up, through reliability, through choosing the same person over and over again. Rachel listened silently. The longer I spoke, the more her expression changed. Not because I was revealing secrets, because I was describing things she had stopped seeing. People often notice grand gestures. They overlook quiet loyalty. Eventually, Rachel lowered her eyes. I thought you were becoming distant. I was becoming comfortable, I replied. There is a difference. The words seemed to hit her harder than anything else I had said. Comfortable, stable, predictable. Those qualities had become weaknesses in her mind because she spent too much time comparing reality to fantasy. The excitement she chased was never designed to last. Stability was. As the afternoon continued, Rachel finally addressed the subject both of us had been avoiding. Brandon and I are done. Her voice sounded exhausted. Not heartbroken. Exhausted. I nodded without reacting. She noticed. You are not surprised. No. Rachel looked out the window. Neither am I. The honesty of that admission said more than a lengthy explanation ever could. Whatever image Brandon projected had dissolved quickly under pressure. Once reality entered the picture, the attraction lost its foundation. Then came the moment I knew was inevitable. Rachel reached across the table. Not dramatically, not desperately, simply reaching for connection. Michael, I know I do not deserve this question. I remained silent. But is there any chance we can start over? There it was. The question hidden behind every apology, every explanation, every regret. For the first time since the party, Rachel was no longer defending her decision. She was asking for a second chance. The strange thing was that hearing the question brought no sense of victory. I did not feel powerful. I did not feel vindicated. I simply felt tired. 14 years of marriage cannot be reduced to one terrible night. But neither can one terrible night be erased because someone regrets it afterward. Rachel's eyes filled with tears she had spent hours trying to hold back. I was wrong, she said quietly. About you. About us. About everything. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I stood up from the table. Rachel's expression changed immediately. Fear, uncertainty, hope, all mixed together. She thought she already knew my answer. The truth was that I did not know it myself. Some decisions require more than emotion. They require time. I picked up my jacket and looked at the woman I had loved for 14 years. The woman who publicly ended our marriage less than 2 days earlier. The woman now asking me not to walk away. Rachel, I said calmly, whether we have a future together is not a question I can answer today. A tear slipped down her cheek. I continued, but for the first time in a very long time, I think we are finally having an honest conversation. And in that moment, I realized the next choice belonged entirely to me. The weeks that followed were some of the quietest and most important weeks of my life. There were no dramatic confrontations, no grand declarations, no sudden miracle that erased everything that had happened. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, there were conversations. Honest conversations. Difficult conversations. The kind that should have happened long before a microphone and a ballroom full of strangers became part of our story. Rachel and I met several times after that afternoon at the coffee shop. Sometimes we talked for hours. Other times we sat in silence, trying to understand how two people who once knew each other so well had drifted so far apart. Slowly, patterns began emerging. We discovered that many of our problems had not started with betrayal. They had started with assumptions. Rachel assumed stability meant stagnation. I assumed consistency was enough to communicate love. We were both wrong. The more we talked, the more I realized something important. Rachel's greatest mistake was not choosing the wrong person. It was forgetting the value of the right one. And my greatest mistake was believing that loyalty never needed to be spoken because it was already being demonstrated. One evening, nearly a month after the party, Rachel asked me to meet her at a small park where we used to walk when we were first married. The weather was beautiful. Children played in the distance, while families enjoyed the last light of the day. When I arrived, Rachel was already waiting near the lake. She looked nervous. More nervous than she had at the coffee shop. More nervous than she had looked standing in front of 100 people. I owe you one final apology, she said. I listened quietly. Not because I hope it changes your decision. Not because I expect forgiveness. But because it is true. She took a deep breath. I stopped appreciating the life we built because I became distracted by a life that only existed in my imagination. The honesty in her voice was impossible to miss. And I embarrassed the person who deserved my respect the most. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The lake reflected the golden colors of sunset. The same place where we once planned our future now felt like a place where we were deciding whether any future remained at all. Finally, Rachel looked at me. Do you know what hurts the most? She asked. What? The night I thought I was walking towards something better was actually the night I threw away the best thing I already had. There was no manipulation in the statement. No strategy. Just regret. Genuine regret. And for the first time since this entire journey began, I felt something shift inside me. Not because the pain disappeared. It did not. Not because trust had magically returned. It had not. But because I could finally see a path forward. It would not be easy. It would not be quick. Yet it existed. I looked at Rachel and smiled softly. If we try again, it will not be because of history. She listened carefully. It will not be because of guilt either. A tear formed in her eyes. Then why? She asked. Because both of us finally understand what we almost lost. Rachel nodded slowly. The relief on her face was immediate. Not relief that everything was fixed. Relief that the door was not completely closed. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, we started walking along the lake together. Not as a couple pretending nothing happened. Not as strangers. Just two people willing to rebuild something that had nearly been destroyed. Looking back now, I sometimes think about that party. The speech. The humiliation. The moment everyone expected me to fight for someone who had already decided to leave. The truth is that I never needed to fight that night. Life handled the lesson on its own. A few minutes after Rachel publicly ended our marriage, reality began showing her everything she had failed to see. And in the end, The greatest victory was not business success, public recognition, or proving anyone wrong. The greatest victory was discovering whether honesty could still find its way back home. Fortunately for both of us, it could.